Hi, I'm Scott Love. I'm the CEO of Codence. We're a Claris Platinum partner, and we've been doing FileMaker work for years. We've done a lot of projects. Some have gone really, really well, and I'll admit some haven't. And so what I'd like to do today is talk about how to be successful with a Claris partner and how to get your project or your relationship off to a good start. And when you talk about success in a software development project, I think one of the first things we think about is project management, or at least one of the first things we should be thinking about, right? And project management has all kinds of ways to manage the uncertainties that you face when you embark upon a project. There's, different methodologies like Agile and Waterfall and so forth. You've got lots of tools to use. You can have different roles on teams. Estimating methodologies and so on and so forth. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to rewind and get to that very first meeting where you're choosing the partner that you're working with. I've been in lots of conversations with potential clients, some of whom have chosen to work with us and some haven't. And I've been on the other side of the table as well. I've hired vendors and I've hired folks here at Codence and so forth. I know what those conversations are, and some of them are effective in teasing apart any concerns or setting you up for success, and some are less successful. I think sometimes people can go into those conversations without a game plan. And so what I'd like to do today is give you a game plan for having that conversation with a Claris partner. So, and first, it's sort of meta. You start talking about the meeting itself. What is the meeting that you're doing and how is it set up? And even before the meeting begins, I'd encourage you to think about, how did the partner handle scheduling the meeting? Were they professional, prompt in replying? Did they give you various ways of communicating? Did they give you access to an online calendar or whatever? How did they handle that? And you can also get information about a partner through looking at their website, reading reviews, checking out LinkedIn or social media and that kind of stuff. So there's a way to understand and come prepared to the meeting. On your side, it's useful for you to know roughly kind of what budget constraints you may have, what documentation you have, how do you describe your existing solution, and so forth. I think those are all important pieces of the puzzle. Then in the meeting itself, again, we're sort of at that meta layer first. Professionalism. Did the partner come and present well? Is their environment reasonable? You're here with me in my living room, for example. I put on a jacket once a year if I have to or not. Time management. Were they managing an agenda? Did they use an agenda? And so forth. Were they good about follow-up? And so forth. Again, these are all cues as to what working with a potential partner will be like when you get there. And then read between the lines as you're meeting with them. Were they too passive? Did they simply sort of show up and go, so what do you need? And you directed the entire conversation. The whole idea is that you're hiring an expert who knows how to manage both themselves, the project, the technology in question, in this case, Claris, the Claris platform, and so forth. Or on the flip side, were they too aggressive? In other words, did they not give you a chance to ask the questions that you need to ask? And were they just sort of wanting to cut to the chase and get to the sales pitch? So both ways, I think, can miss the mark. So step back. You're sort of analyzing that initial meeting. How do they comport themselves? But at the end of the day, I think it's important to orient yourself and your potential partner, see if they're in sync with this approach, is to really zero in on why you're here. And I think one of the biggest things that we can struggle with in life, and this is true for hiring a software development vendor, and it's true for being in relationships and in your personal life and so forth, is that we often are expected to read minds. And I think one of the key sort of breakdowns in any relationship is when there are unspoken or misunderstood expectations that don't get met. And those can often be that root cause to cause a relationship to break down and for trust to erode and so forth. It's a mismatch in what you expect from the other person. Now, when you're thinking about a software development project, I would start by teasing apart expectations with your role as a stakeholder. The vendor in question, they don't potentially know your business. They might know similar businesses, but they don't know your business. And they certainly don't know you yet. And so what are your business objectives? And again, I'm not talking about, oh, we need a TPS report to sort our data by, day of month or whatever. Those are tasks, those are features. I'm talking about business objectives. Why are you building what you're building? Are you trying to save money? Are you trying to make better decisions? Are you trying to reduce friction in your team, make something more efficient, maybe integrate two systems that require, say, for example, manual entry in this case today? That's an example where you might save time if you build an integration. But let's think about that for a minute. If you build an integration, it costs $1 million and you save 2 minutes a year, there's not a good return on investment there. So this is a case where your team, your partner, and you need to be really clear about why you're doing what you're doing. And then the last one here, improve job satisfaction. There's an emotional component to working day-to-day in life. And sometimes the payoff isn't necessarily directly tied to time or money or what have you. Maybe it's just, gosh, the system is better for your team to work with. It's smoother, or it's more intuitive, or gosh, even more pleasant. There is a value in that. The question is, does it make sense in terms of what the cost is? So again, my point is, in terms of setting expectations and being clear in the relationship, I encourage you right out of the gate, talk about the value as to why you're wanting to do what you're doing. And then there are the classic project drivers. What kind of timing? Do you need it done in a week, a month, or you don't care when? Budget. I'll be candid. I encourage candor. Again, none of us read minds. And I think it's super helpful and clear when someone says, look, this system makes sense to me for 10 grand and it doesn't make sense to me for 100 grand, or whatever your numbers are. I'd encourage you to just be straight about that. And of course you want estimates and you want to make sure that someone isn't taking advantage of you. But I think in that dialogue, you can get to clear expectations. And that's that bedrock that the relationship stands on. Time and budget is pretty clear stuff. It costs what it costs and it takes how much time it takes. And you can adjust those to a very large degree, but they are adjusted by scope. And so then the real question is, how do we determine scope? And before you sort of get into, in this first conversation that you're having with a vendor, before you get into that, figure out, how are you going to have conversations about scope with that person or that team? Are you going to design it all up front on paper, like an architect, drawing up blueprints before you start building a building? Or are you going to invent as you go? One of the key values to FileMaker and the Claris platform is the fact that you can organically just keep adding stuff as you go along. And I think a lot of partnerships, a lot of development teams forget that along the way, because we build sort of increasingly complex systems and you want to kind of get it right and so forth. In many cases, I encourage our clients to lean into the flexibility that FileMaker offers. You don't have to design it all up front. Build the leg of the elephant, mixing my metaphors, that's okay, and then move on, to the rest of it. Anyway, again, I'm not advocating one approach necessarily over another. I'm just simply suggesting be clear with your team, your partner, what your approach is going to be and how are you going to make decisions about scope. Now, you may be sort of thinking about, gosh, we're talking about relationship, we're talking about goals, project management is getting sprinkled in the mix here. When do we roll up our sleeves and start talking about the actual reason why I'm talking to a vendor in the first place? I'd really encourage you to take a beat. Rather than just immediately start diving in about, in my silly example, a TPS report and what that entails and where you're going to get data and, the problem that you're wrestling with in your organization. There is time to get to that, I promise. But I encourage you to put the relationship first. I think it's important when you take on a project that'll last, say weeks or months, or a relationship that will last potentially for years. And many of our client relationships have lasted years. I think it's important to think in terms of that relationship in the beginning. How are we going to work together? And then roll up your sleeves and start talking about the work. I think it's a mistake to get in too quickly on the actual project. Anyway, kind I recognize that, at the end of the day, we're all busy and we need to cut to the chase and get to it. So there's got to be a happy medium here, but I'm hoping that some of these thoughts are fruitful for you. All right, so you've talked about goals. I'm sort of advocating that clarity about expectations is an important thing to zero in on. Then you get into the actual assessment of the vendor. And I've been assessed lots in my life, both in relationships and in my professional life. And some of those assessments have gone great. And we're all human, right? Anyway, one of the first things that I think is important to assess in evaluating Claris partners is their credibility. Do they have the expertise that you need? And already, if they're a platinum level partner, Claris has done a certain amount of vetting. Is their team certified? If you have an opportunity to meet the actual developers who will be assigned to your project, then great, you can assess that a little bit. And unfortunately, the reason why you're hiring these folks, presumably, is because you may not be an expert in the platform yourself, and that's okay. I think there are some indicators that you can look to. Have they done similar projects in the past? Do they have some testimonials and recommendations they can share? And then I think it's useful as a potentially non-coder to talk about, again, how they manage their work. So what is their QA process in particular? How do they ensure quality? And do they know other technologies? Do they have folks that come from software engineering backgrounds at all? Or are they all sort of, as is common, I include myself in this, are they all just sort of homegrown, FileMaker folks who learned it along the way? I think those are all cues that you can look for to assess whether or not someone's got the expertise you need. You can also tell by the questions they ask and as they get into the requirements side of a project if they've got some technical expertise. And obviously, the best way to assess if someone is technically competent is to maybe bite off a small piece and give them, a little bit of work and see how they do with that or what have you. From credibility and expertise, then I would encourage you to look for reliability. Will they do what they say they will when they say they'll do it? Can you depend on them? And so here's where project management comes in. Do they even have project managers in their organizations? Do they assign one to your team? And is their project manager actively engaged in the process of the project, or is that really just someone who schedules and does billing? Ask them to describe their process. How do they go from idea on a whiteboard to documentation to finished code? Maybe talk about cases where processes failed, because it fails all the time. What do they do about it? How do they handle it? This is going to start to give you insights into the approach that they use to mitigate risk and to manage the work that you're doing together. Estimating is always a big deal, so I'd ask about, how do you do estimates and what's involved with that? And are estimates then delivered as fixed, commitments, or are they squishy? Do you, what happens when you've got an estimate for something that's 4 hours and suddenly, it took 16 or, what have you? Talking about that, I think, is helpful because then it allows you to manage a project to a budget and a timeline, the other project rails, if you will, that you need to follow. And then what roles on a project? And then what do they need from you? I think that can help you, again, get some insight into how they manage. The third piece of the puzzle, you've got credibility and expertise, you've got reliability, and will they deliver what they say they will? Can you lean on them? Is their motivation? This one's hard to get to. So bear with me. I've got some ideas on the slide here, but this one requires really that you have some experience working with someone to gauge whether or not they are truly oriented to your needs or if they're pursuing their own agendas. But in the initial meeting, I think you can watch for cues. Do they really engage in the why of the project? Do they seem to really sort of understand that you've got a business to run and that a system that costs, $10 million doesn't make any sense? And, an investment of, whatever, pick the rational number that's an alternative to that may make sense or does make sense. But there's how do they engage with the context in which a project is being run? Do they understand that there's more to life and business than just coding out an awesome application? If they really are just focused on coding out an awesome application, then that's a self-centered view of the world. They're not here to serve necessarily. They're here to just sort of exercise their talent and joy in programming. Anyway, it's a bit of a stretch, but see if there's food for thought in that comment. Ask them what happens when things go wrong in the relationship. How do they handle it? How do they approach it? I think, again, that can give you some insights. Ask them what they need from you. And in their answer, do they talk about it as a relationship, or do they just literally say, okay, what I need from you is to pay your invoices on time and, go down their list of self-focused things, or are they focused on the success of the project? Ask them point blank, what risks do they see in front of them if you choose to work together? What could go wrong? And see if they're thinking about that. And the last bullet here, do they share your culture and values? I have no idea how you get that information in the midst of an interview. But if you've got clear values in your organization, or if you've got a way to describe your culture, you might do so and see how they respond. A lot of this is reading between the lines and sort of being, perceptive of the unspoken cues that people give you. But I think as a checklist of things to look for in this initial meeting, definitely try to zero in on what is their orientation towards altruism and service. All right, so presumably you've had a lot to talk about in this initial conversation with a vendor. I think the sort of the wrap up, the landing, is an important one. And I focus on building good agreements with folks as best I can. So again, candor is a good thing. I'd encourage you to be clear and to spend some time talking to your potential Claris partner as to what is the decision-making process you go through together. What are the next steps? How do they make commitments? And making commitments is, of course, different than sort of, wishful thinking or over-promising or what have you. I think I always listen to see if someone is anxious to please or anxious to serve. The distinction being, pleasing is just, hey, they want me to like them. Service, is if I'm in the weeds and I say, hey, I want my FileMaker solution to serve, a public website with no authentication, millions of users per second. I would hope, that's an obvious extreme example, but I would hope that a good service-oriented consultant would say, that's a really bad idea, and here's why. And instead, here's how we would recommend taking things on. So how do they talk to power is the question here. And then ask them specifically along the way, what moments, what circumstances occur when we have to renegotiate, and what is that? Do we renegotiate budget? Do we change timeline? How do we engage in that conversation together? Are you going to give me a heads up when the project is sort of going wiggly or whatnot? So talk about that. Be clear about how you're going to work together in terms of decision making and managing your project constraints, budget, time, etc. And then, it's funny. I've put together a lot of proposals in my life. And I know, because I've done the same thing myself, you just scroll down to the money part. You just read that part, right? Well, some of us are more detail-oriented than others. I'm not going to admit in this recording as to on which part of that spectrum I sit, but it's not just about dollars, right? You need to look for, are there protections in your contract for non-disclosure, proprietary information? What about the solicitation of employees in both directions? You might discover that one of the teammates with whom you're working is amazing at your partner. They've invested lots of energy and time in training that person. Have they thought about a non-solicitation clause? And is it reasonable, or is it just a blanket like, oh, you can never do this and we'll sue your pants off or whatever? Extremism in contracts isn't really useful. It's can we manage the relationship together? What are the payment terms? Do they suit you? Are there warranties or guarantees? Oftentimes in these contracts, we do this here at Codence. We say, okay, there's an acceptance period where presumably you're doing your work as a stakeholder, looking at a solution and making sure it works as you expect. And then after that point, it's considered that you've accepted the work. And one of the challenges with the FileMaker and the Claris platform is, again, it's organic, it's flexible. And so drawing the line and saying, okay, this meets all of the requirements that we intended at some point along the way, that can be a challenge. So anyway, take a look at how those guarantees are handled in contracts. Are there acceptance criteria or time frame, as I mentioned, and then are there mediation avenues? I'm not trying to present myself as an attorney. Clearly, I hope that's very clear, not. But I think these are things to look for, again, to see, is this partner a good fit for you? I think that's about it in terms of the checklist that I go through in an initial meeting. And to summarize that, I've got a few more slides past this one, but to summarize that again, you look for professionalism. Did they handle the communication well? If they're on Zoom, do they know how to operate Zoom? What's their focus? Is their focus on just, spitting out as quickly as they can what their terms are, or do they really engage and treat this first consultation as both a trial run for getting to know you and the relationship and making sure that the two of you want to work together? And are they interested in your business and your goals and ultimately in your requirements? Are they credible? Are they reliable? Do they have altruistic intentions? I hope I've given you some tips on how to tease out some of those items. And then lastly, how do they manage commitments? I think if you cover these 6 points, you're going to be in a good place. Now, obviously, I've mentioned it along the way here. What's not here? I haven't talked about how to roll up your sleeves and start talking about requirements. And I think that's a huge part of all of this. One of the biggest, one of the biggest reasons why projects fail is not that requirements haven't been detailed, it's that they've been missed, or that there's, some element of a project that you had in your head and the development team didn't hear it or didn't absorb it, and here you are. You've got a car with 4 wheels, or whatever. Anyway, requirements are a big deal. I could do a whole presentation on how to do requirements gathering work. I think that really the lesson I'm trying to focus on here, though, is don't skip the relationship. Remember that it's about working together. You're as much interviewing someone for a job and considering hiring them, say, like the way you'd approach an actual recruiting interview is very different than, hiring a vendor. I'm encouraging you to take some of the lessons that you've gleaned from interviewing folks and bringing them into your company, apply those same skills here. And I will touch on, I think that in my experience, when projects go off the rails, that has so much more to do with the relationship than it does the budget or what have you that you may have spoken about at the beginning of a project. It's really about that working relationship. And the inverse is true as well. I think if you end a project and you're satisfied with the budget, it's because the relationship went well. It's not because that budget may represent or what have you, the expectations that you shared in the very beginning. You may well change your mind along the way. In fact, I said almost all. I actually think all of our clients do. They do opt to add features, change features, and we adjust course together. And as long as the relationship can handle that well, you're in a good place. And if the relationship can't, then no contract or no perfectly written statement of work is going to get you out of that problem. So again, I think success sits on the relationship, not on contract terms or good project management documentation or what have you. Those are important, but they're not the key. So that's my speech here. I'm encouraging you to really find a way to build something together. Start with the relationship, get to know your vendor. Certainly, we've got many great, rich relationships with wonderful clients of ours. We've had some relationships go south, and that in part is what inspired this talk. I really appreciate your time today. I hope this has been interesting, and obviously, if we can be of service, please reach out. Thanks very much.